idea of Lashon HaKodesh. Lashon HaKodesh means the sacred language, the holy language. And why is it called Lashon HaKodesh? Why is it actually called, why is Hebrew, ancient Hebrew more, why is it called holy? What is the definition of holy? And why is it called holy? So there was an argument, this is quite a famous argument between the Rambam, the great scholar, Moshe ben Maimon, otherwise known as Maimonides, 1300s, 13th century, from 1204 to 1335, a great scholar. The Rambam writes that, the Rambam writes this in the Mar Nevuchim, in the Garth of Perplexed, in chapter 3:8. The Rambam writes like this, that the reason why Lashon HaKodesh is called holy, the reason why this language is called holy, he says because we don't find, it's a very refined language, and we don't find anywhere in the Torah where the Torah describes physical intimacy, acts of types of physical intimacy, whether positive or negative. We don't find that the Torah has a description of that word. There is no word for intimacy in the Torah. And the way the Torah uses, the language of the Torah uses is sort of euphemisms. It uses like an allusions to the idea. Like when it says that V'yada Adam Eschava, that Adam knew his wife, or came to his wife. But the actual act of intimacy is not described. The Rambam also explains that, for example, also with types of bodily emissions, the Torah uses euphemisms and metaphors to explain it. That's why he says that it's a sacred language, it's a holy language. This is what the Rambam, Maimonides, the Rambam writes. The Ramban famously argues, the Ramban is Moshe ben Nachman, a later scholar, that the Ramban, also a Spanish scholar, but not from Andalus, but from Catalonia, the Ramban writes that this is, if that's the reason why it's called Lashon HaKodesh, it's called sacred language because it doesn't have descriptions for these types of acts, then it should be called a modest language, not a holy language. And the Ramban writes in his commentary to Shmois 30:13, the Ramban writes that the reason why it's called a holy language is because it's the language of creation. Which will explain what this means, it's the language of revelation, which is the language of the prophets, the language of the Nevi'im, and it's the language of communication, divine communication to man. It's also the language, Ramban explains, that it's also the language of the names of Hashem, that all the names of God, all the names of Hashem are described in the Torah, are Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, so therefore it's a sacred language. In fact, the Ramban also wrote a letter called Igars Kodesh, a holy epistle, a holy letter, which the Ramban explains in contrast to the Rambam that says that intimacy, physical intimacy, is an unholy act, or like the Rambam writes other areas, the Rambam is Chabri Lanu, it's like an embarrassing act. It's a needed act, it's a required act, but it's embarrassing to man. It shows the unrefinement of man. The Ramban writes this holy epistle, holy letter, and he says, on the contrary, that if it's done if it's done in the proper place, in the proper time, with the proper person, it's not only holy, but it's Kodesh HaKodashim, it's the Holy of Holies, and that's why he calls it the Holy Letter. So here's this argument between if it's a language it's holy because of its modesty, its form of modesty, the way it's described things, or is there something inherent in this language in terms of its creation and in terms of revelation and prophecy? So when we talk about the language as the language of creation, this goes back fundamentally to the book of Sefer Yetzirah, which speaks about the Hebrew letters, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the 22 holy letters, as the means through which creation emerges into existence. That when it speaks about creation, the process of creation is Vayomer Hashem Yihya. Hashem says, "Let there be light," and there was light. So there's a type of spiritual vibration, a divine vibration, which says light, and light creates the letters that form the letters of light, form actually light. So it's a tziruf, it's a combination of different sounds. Let's say, for example, so to say it a little differently, there's the light of Hashem, which is infinite, or comparatively infinite to our conceptions of what finitude is and what infinity is. And then there are pockets of energy that hold this light. Each of the sounds of the Hebrew letters are these pockets of energy, so to speak. And when they're combined into different formations, they create different realities. That's what the Gemara says also about Betzalel. The Gemara Bracha says about Betzalel, the architect of the Mishkan, that Betzalel was able to combine the letters that were created in the world, which means that the reason why he's the architect of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle in the desert, which is a replica and a reflection, according to the Ramban, of the upper worlds or the experience of Sinai, to recreate Sinai in real time, he knew how to combine those letters. That was the idea. So there is something about the 22 letters of the alphabet, of the Aleph Beis, which are sort of the root sounds. These are the root sounds, or the primary sounds. Ah, ba, and there is, each letter has its king vowel, like it's brought down in Sefer Kabbalah, Sefer Chassidus. That idea of the king vowel means the essential vowel. So Aleph, ah, is the sound of ah, is the essential sound for Aleph, even though ah could be sounded as u or e or oi, but its essential sound is Aleph. Beis, which is a tzere sound, an a sound. The essential sound of Beis is bay, or beis. So that sound of ah or bay, these are the essential sounds, and the combination of these sounds creates the possibility of language, and therefore the spiritual, metaphysical source of creation. These sounds, these 22 letters, which is the essential sounds of creation, is similar to what contemporary understanding of some type of universal grammar, which is that all language share certain components, certain basic properties that are shared with all common language, even though there are different families of languages, and even languages come from different parts, are sounded from different parts of the throat, etc. And they have different they share commonalities between certain languages, but not with other languages. But there's some type of universal grammar, which is the root of the sound. So the roots of the sound, the root sound or the root language is Lashon HaKodesh. The Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew language, not the modern Hebrew language, but the biblical Hebrew language, the Torah language, is the language of the root of the sounds. Therefore, since it's the universal language, or the primary language, there's an interesting idea that Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who was a very famous scholar that lived in the 1700s, he passed away in 1776. Rabbi Yaakov Emden was a very eclectic type of scholar. He wrote on a lot of different things. He wrote on Chumash, he wrote on commentaries on Chumash, he wrote on halacha, on philosophy and Kabbalah, and critiques. He wrote many different things, autobiography. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes, in Migdal Oz, he writes something interesting. He says that if a child is born in the wild, which is, if you know a little bit what was going on in the world at that time, that was part of the conversation that many of the contemporary philosophers were talking about, this idea, if man is born in the wild, what would be his nature, if it would be neutral, or it be negative, or be positive, and there was a very big debate between many of the philosophers that lived in that time. Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes a parallel idea, asking a question that if man would be born in the wild, would he speak a language, and if language was not taught to him, would he have language? And Rabbi Yaakov Emden says that he would, that the language that he would have would be Lashon HaKodesh, because this is the primary language, the primary way of forming of sounds. Obviously, it's not in its perfect formation, but he would have these primary root sounds that is the essential ingredients or properties of Lashon HaKodesh, of this sacred language. So a person born in the wild would speak Lashon HaKodesh. Interestingly, the Pirkei Rebbe, which is a commentary, sort of a midrashic commentary on the unfolding of the story of the Torah, in chapter 26, the Pirkei Rebbe speaks about Avram Avinu, and it says that Abraham was, when he was born, he was hidden for 13 years after he was born, because of that time period. It was complicated, and there was time of persecution, and he was hidden. And when he emerged from the cave, this is the Pirkei Rebbe writes, the Medrash writes that when he emerged from the cave, he was speaking Lashon Kodesh, he was speaking the sacred language, which would be a support to this idea of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Also, parenthetically, in our Gemara, in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud, the Gemara says the Sukkim and Beis. The Gemara speaks about when a child when a child doesn't need his mother, etc. When he should buy a lulav, and when a father should teach him. It says when a father when a child knows how to speak, a boy knows how to speak, the father should teach him Torah. But this same teaching also appears in the Yerushalmi and Chagiga in 1:3 and Perek Aleph Gimel, and also appears in Yerushalmi of Sukkah. That the also in Perek Gimel Lachab Beis 3:2, the Yerushalmi says in Sukkah over there that Katan Shein Tzarech L'Imay is Chayav B'Sukkah, is obligated to sit in a Sukkah. A child that doesn't need for his mother, doesn't need to hold his mother, doesn't cry for his mother continuously. And Yedei L'Daber, if a child knows how to speak, then of the Malam de Torah, a father teaches a child Torah Tifalon Moshe Kelis Yaakov teaches him Torah, and Lashon HaKodesh teaches him Lashon HaKodesh. It actually teaches him to speak Lashon HaKodesh, which means that there's an obligation a parent should teach the child Lashon HaKodesh, the sacred language, Hebrew. Rashi actually also brings us down. Rashi brings them down in Dvarim, Perek Yud Aleph, in his commentary in Dvarim and Deuteronomy 11:19. Rashi brings down from the Sifra also this idea that a child has to be taught Lashon HaKodesh, and the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos in Avos, in his commentary of Avos, and when it says Havezar Mitzvah Kal Kechamura, that a person should be careful with a mitzvah that is lighter and something that is more stringent. So Rashi writes, the Rambam writes, what is a mitzvah kala? What is the definition of a mitzvah kala? For example, the idea of learning Lashon Kodesh, to teach Lashon Kodesh. That's a kala kamor. Anyways, so we have this idea that there is a universal language, or universal grammar, universal sound, a primary language. Lashon Kodesh is the primary language. And then there's other languages. So what are the other languages? Let's try to understand this, the connection between Lashon Kodesh, which is the primary language, and the other languages of the world. So in the Torah, when it describes the story of Babel, it says that there was a Safa Achas, there was one language. And Rashi writes that in the beginning of the narrative, the beginning of human civilization, there was one language. And Rashi writes, what is that language? Before man was dispersed throughout the entire planet, the entire earth, when the language was, says Rashi in the name of the Medrash, that this language was Lashon Kodesh. This was like the sacred language, because it was a one language that was expressing, like the Zohar says, and the Yalkut Shimoni says, that there was a one language that was expressing the oneness of Hashem. So the Achdus Hashem the oneness of Hashem was being expressed in this one language, and then it was a bilbul of the Lashonis. There was a multiplicity of languages, and became into the 70 semi-root languages of the creation, which these 70 correspond to the 70 nations of the world. And every single nation, every single peoplehood, and a distinct peoplehood has, now there's millions of different dialects, but has generally this idea of these 70 languages. These are the 70 root branch languages. So there's like the root language is Lashon Kodesh. It flowers into the branches, and then the branches have multiple twigs, so to speak, and has many different variations. But there's the 70 languages. So we'll talk about the 70 languages. So there's the Lashon Kodesh, the essential language, the root language, which expresses the Achdus Hashem, the oneness of Hashem, which is through Goy Echad Ba'aretz, through the oneness of people that expresses the oneness of the Lashon Kodesh. That's the klal, that's the principle. And then there's the pratim, which is the specifics or the multiplicity and the branches that arise from this root languages. So the root language, Lashon Kodesh, another way of saying it is the pnim, is the internality, is the inner quality. And the way the Arizal speaks about, the Holy Arizal speaks about Lashon Haramis, which is very close to Lashon HaKodesh, like Aramaic, which is the language of the Talmud, is that's the Chitzonius. The Arizal speaks about in Priyatz Chaim, in Shar HaKodesh, that it represents the external part of the language. So there is the pnimius, the internal language, and then there's the external language. Or to say it differently, there is the klal, the principle, and then there's the pratim, which is the details. The principle is the one, the unity, the achdus, and the pratim, the specifics, is already the detail, which is the world of period, of separation. Misham Yaparid, from the place of oneness, it becomes separation. So there's the oneness of language, which is the unity of language, there's universal grammar, the essential language, the sacred language, the kodesh, the pnim, the holy, the inner. And then from that language, it's noiveya, it spreads out into many different languages, the 70 languages of the world. In the Torah itself, since the Torah is the root, and it's the klal, it's expressing the principle, therefore you find pratim, you find the specifics of other languages even within the Torah. For example, famous example, that the Gemara also says in Gemara Megillah, the Gemara says, Igar Sadusa. When Yaakov and Lavan are dealing, and they set up a gale, they set up a pillar of rocks as a witness. So in Hebrew it's called galed, and the Torah says, and this is called Yigar Sadusa. And Yigar Sadusa is a language that's not indigenous, that's not part of Lashon HaKodesh. So even in the Torah itself, you have a hint to the other languages. The Ramban in Dvarim, at the end of Dvarim in Perek Lamed Gimel 33-25, the Ramban writes, we said the Ramban who argues with the Rambam, it says Lashon HaKodesh is because it's the language of creation and the revelation. The name is Hashem. The Ramban writes that there are other words in the Torah besides Yigar Sadusa, which is also Aramaic words or other language words. Now, famously, Latoitafais is Lashon Afriki, but the Ramban also writes, for example, when it talks about Kimecha Davecha, that it'll be like Davecha. What is the word Davecha? So the Ramban writes that Zion in Aramaic, Zion and Dalet are interchangeable. So Davecha is actually Zavecha, that it'll be like gold. Your days will be like gold. And the commentary on the Ramban, which is one of the students of the Ramban, an indirect student, Rabbeinu Bechaya. So Rabbeinu Bechaya writes in his commentary also on Dvarim, in Deuteronomy, and Dvarim on 33-25, the Rabbeinu Bechaya writes that there are many such words in the Torah where it's not indigenous, it's not originally a Lashon Kodesh language, it's not part of the Lashon Kodesh, it's not part of the sacred language. And he says, for example, also you have in Devarim, you have Asa Merviu as Kodesh, that the word Asa is not a Hebrew word, is not a Lashon Kodesh word. And he says there are many such words. And he says that the Torah itself has both these languages, has both Lashon Kodesh and Lashon Aramis, has both Lashon Kodesh, predominant Lashon Kodesh, but also has languages from Aramaic languages as well. And in his language, he says this is also why Ravina Rabashi, when they set up the Gemara, they also wrote in that way, which is a combination of these two languages. And he says because the Shema Adon, V'Shem Ashliach, it's the name of the master and the name of the servant, which is the servant is Matarton, is Metatron. That the idea of that angel is Sar Shaloilam, the prince of the world. And he says V'Ein Roi Lahachiv. And the truth is I shouldn't continue, I shouldn't write any more about this. So he keeps it as more like a cryptic statement. But the idea is that there is, within the Torah itself, within the Lashon Kodesh itself, which is the revealing of Lashon Kodesh, of the sacred language within the Torah itself, you have other languages as well. What's the principle? What is the idea trying to express? That there is the root language, which is Lashon Kodesh, the sacred language, and then from Lashon Kodesh, from this Lashon Kodesh, it spills out and reveals itself, and it multiplies into various different languages. The various different languages are the Shivim Lashonis, the 70 languages, which 70 languages is essentially what the 70 languages are, which we said before are like the branch languages, and then it multiplies into millions of different dialects. But the branch languages, not just the 5 families of languages, but the 70 types of languages, which is obviously connected to the 5, is that the Shivim Lashonis, the 70 languages, is another form of Tziruf Ha'osis, is another form of the combination of letters. That's why Balafia writes, Rav Malafia in Mishefer, at the end of Mishefer writes that the word Shivim Lashonis has the same numeric value as Tziruf Ha'osis, the combination of letters, because the combination of these sounds, every single language is a combination of different sounds. So if you're speaking a dialect, if you're speaking English or German, or grammatic language, or you're speaking a Aramaic language, or an Asian language, an African language, you're always going to use sounds, and the original sounds are going to be the 22 letters of the Torah and its variations. And then from those sounds, you're going to have multiple different languages. So it's a different type of, different forms of combinations of sounds, which creates all the different types of languages. So all of the variants of languages is originally in those original sounds. So all other languages essentially is a pirush, a commentary, or a reflection or inflection of the original language of Lashon HaKodesh. The phrase pirush, pirush, a commentary or translation, is actually used by the Ravid when the Ravid, in the beginning of Hilchos Kishma, on the Rambam, when the Rambam says in Perek Beis, I believe, that the Rambam writes that that when a person says Shema in other languages, b'chol lashon tishmeya, you're allowed to say Krishna in any language. The Rambam says that even so, you should be very medaic. You should be very careful exactly how you pronounce the words, even if you're saying, let's say, in English or in Japanese. So you have to be very careful how you say the Shema. And the Ravid argues with that because this is the Pirush, this is the commentary. But the idea is that other languages is a commentary of the original language. So there's the origin of language, which is the original primary language, which is based on these 22 sounds of the Hebrew alphabet, of the Hebrew language, of the Aleph Beis, and then they multiply and they proliferate into different forms, different languages. There's a principle that it's an halachic principle, but the Zohar brings it down as a spiritual principle. The principle is that there's klal, prat, klal. Klal means a general, prat means a specific, and klal means a general. So sometimes in the Torah would describe, this is a halachic idea, that sometimes, and it's machlokes, if you read, it's an argument whether you read klal, prat, and klal, or riba, miyat, and riboy. A lot, specific, and then a lot again. So there are two ways how to read it. So let's say the Torah describes something and says a general principle. Then the Torah reduces that general principle and says it's only regarding this specific scenario. And then later the Torah gives a third analogy a little further on. It says that, it sounds like it's including everything. So the principle is like this: if it's riboy miyat, riboy, if you argue that way, that it's a lot, a little, then a lot. So like Rashi writes and Sukkah explains that the idea is that it's riboy hakoel. The Torah describes something in general, in a lot, in its broadest definition, and then describes things in a very limited definition, then describes it again in its broadest definition. So since the limited definition is not excluding or in conversation with the general more inclusive definition, therefore the final definition of the riboy includes everything. But when it's klal or prat or klal, that's the way you read it. We read it as a principle, a specific, and a principle. Ein b'chal el mash yesh b'prat. The general, there's a general in the beginning statement, then there's a specific statement, and then a general statement. So the general only includes everything that is similar to the specific scenario, which was given in the second scenario. So you have a first scenario, which is general; second scenario, which is specific; third scenario, which is general. So the third one, ein b'chal el mash b'prat. There's only to reveal what is in the specific. So the general is the inclusion, to say it in a different language. The second principle of the general is the inclusion of all the pratim, of all the specifics. But everything that's exactly those specifics are not specifics that are different. So you have general, which is the idea of a yichud, a singularity, to use this language. It's the idea of a singularity. Then you have a multiplicity, and then you have a singularity again. So the second singularity, which is the second klal, includes all the specifics of the multiplicity of stage 2. So you have a singularity that's the exclusion of pratim, the exclusion of particularity. Then you have particularity, which is specific, and then you have a singularity that includes all the multiplicity and all the division. Okay, that's clear? So that's the klal, prat, and then the klal. This is a halachic definition, and the Zohar says that's the way creation evolves also. There's a long mimer on this, on Shavuos, in Malukah that speaks about this idea at great length. But the idea of a klal, a prat, and a klal, a general, a specific, and then a general. That the singularity includes also all the multiplicity. That's the second singularity. which means like this. That language starts off a safa achas, which is a singularity, only as Lashon HaKodesh, which means the primary language, language of the origin of man. When man begins to speak, when Adam and Eve are beginning to speak, is the language of Lashon HaKodesh. That's the language of people that lived in Mesopotamia, the original language, the Lashon HaKodesh, the sacred language. Then it multiplies into various 70 languages, and then it multiplies into a million different dialects. And then there'll be another klal. We're living in the world of pratim, in the world of specifics, in the world of particularities, in the world of division, in the world of pure, in the world of separation, which is the world of exile. And then will come a redemptive state, which in the redemptive state, the klal, the principle that will be revealed, the oneness will be revealed, the singularity that will be revealed, will be not exclusive, but inclusive of all the particularities as well. So what does that mean? Let's try to understand what this means. So today when you have the word shulchan, let's say for example, the word table in Hebrew, in Lashon Kodesh. So shin lam ches nun, which is the word shulchan, which means table in Lashon Kodesh, is expressing what is the essence of this table. The essence of the table is the sound formation of the shin lam and ches nun, these four letters that are streamed together to create the word table. That's the essence of the table. So when I'm describing a table and I say that it's a shulchan, what I'm really describing is what is the essence quality of the table, is these four-letter vibrational sounds of shin lam and ches nun that are streamed together in this particular tziruf, in this particular formation. But when, let's say, for example, in the English language, when you call a table, then what you're describing is not the essence of the table. What rather, it's the other languages is haskami. Haskami means it's consensus. This is what the Ran writes in the beginning of the Dharm, the Ritv writes in the beginning of the Dharm, that it's the idea of a consensual language, which means that table is called a table is arbitrary, because theoretically you can call a chair a table and a table a chair. It just happens to be that there was a certain consensus amongst English speakers that when you look at something that has a flat surface and has four legs, you call that a table. When you look at something different and it looks different, you call that a chair. But theoretically, you could have called that surface, flat surface with four legs, you can call that a chair, or you can call it a banana, whatever you wish to call it. It happens to be that there was a consensus, and therefore you can survive as a society, as a civilization, because everyone understands that when you say table, you're referring to this particular object. So it's an Askami language. But a Lashon HaKodesh is not the Askami language, it's not the consensus language, but it's actually the thing in itself. It's an expression of what the thing is in itself. That's why, for example, also in Halacha, that when talking about the world of Krishma, of saying of Kriya Shema. So when you say Kriya Shema and B'Lashon HaKodesh, if you say it in the sacred language, in the original language, even if you don't know what you're saying, you fulfill your obligation. Because you're saying something. Because it's happening. What the saying is happening. Because when you're saying Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, the hero of Israel, and you're saying in Lashon HaKodesh, in this language, that is the language of the reality of Shema Yisrael. So therefore you're declaring the reality of what is. But on the other hand, if you're saying Shema, but you're saying it in another language, then only if you understand that language do you fulfill your obligation. So if you're saying it in English, Shema Yisrael, you 100% fulfill the obligation of saying Shema, b'chol lashon she'tishmeya. You can say it in any language. So you could say it in English, here is the Lord is a God, however you translate it, Hashem is one. You could say it and you fulfill the obligation of saying of Shema. But that's only if you speak English. Because if you're a Chinese speaking person and you say it in English and you don't understand what the words mean, it means nothing. Because the only reason why these words mean something is because it's a consensus that these words mean something in the dialect of the people that are speaking English. But if you're a Chinese speaking person or a Japanese speaking person and you're speaking the words in English and you don't understand what you're saying, then you said gibberish, you didn't say anything. So that's why if you don't speak a certain language and you say Shema, let's say in German, but you're an English speaking person, you didn't fulfill the obligation because you didn't say anything. However, if you said Shema in Lashon Kodesh, in the sacred language, even if you don't understand what you're saying, you said something because you express what is the idea of Shema. This is the general idea between the original language and then its substitute language or the other forms of its language, which will be the other languages of the world. But on a deeper level, the fact that in English, for example, I'm using the table as an analogy, the fact that the word table, the spelling of the word table, the sound of the word table is referred to as a table, a specific form, which is the surface of this table. surface of a table, a flat surface with legs, is called a table, means that there is an ashkacha, there's a divine providence, why those specific sounds of table refers to a specific table. This the Rebbe writes in HaKodesh Chelek Chavav, in page 3, right in the R1, that there's an idea that even in the language of the other language is going to be an expression that's going to be something that's going to reveal in that. So what does that mean? Because there was the original language, and then there was the shviras oisius, the brokenness of letters, which is the language of using languages, which is the phrase that the Baal Shem Tov uses, when there's a breaking apart of the sounds, and the sounds are not a reflection of the thing in and of itself. So when you look at a table, and you're not calling it a shulchan, you're not calling it shin lach and ches nun, you're not calling it its original sound, what it actually really is, but you're calling it a table, what you're doing is you're saying that from this original sound, those sounds fell and broke apart into 70 languages, into the other languages, into different sirufim, into other vibrations, other vibrational sounds, and that is now the expression of what this thing is. So you're not seeing the thing in itself. It's not just Lashon Askami only. It's not just a consensus of a language, but on a deeper level, and maybe it's not revealed, there's a certain sound, a broken sound still, that is in a state that's revealing what the table is when you sound the letters of the word table. That's why there is an inherent idea, we'll get to this a little further, but there's an inherent idea that every single expression of what that thing is also a valid expression of what it is. So therefore, this is a very old tradition. There are many Mukabbalim, very famous Mukabbalim Kabbalists and Chassidish rabbis, who would take even, let's say, Yiddish words, which is sort of like a Lashon Aramis of a modern form, which is a language of a Jewish language, Yiddish, and they would also, so Abalafi would do this with this idea even with Greek words, which are not Yiddish. But later on, in the Chassidic rabbis, like the Bnei Yissaschar and Tishrei, and the Pri Arts and Vayigash, and the Divrei Torah of the Munkachet, the Medora Kama, and Perik Beis, there's also in Sefer Sichos and the Rebberatz, the Fili Grama, Tafshin Hey, in page 8, where we take words that are in Yiddish, in the Yiddish vernacular, in the Jewish vernacular, which Yiddish was like some type of German, older German language, and they would do gematria as well. They would do numerical equivalents of numbers. What is the oimik of that idea? Because the oimik, what is the depth of this idea? That the shoyesh of everything, in its root, everything comes from the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Everything comes from the Lashon HaKodesh. That's the root sounds. And then from that root sounds, it multiplies and it blasts off, and there's brokenness, and that's why there's a broken world. The world is not a perfected state, because of the brokenness of the sound. We don't have the correct way of languaging things. And when we don't language things in a correct way, there's brokenness. This is also psychologically true, and emotionally true, and mentally true. This is, on all levels, this is true. And on a metaphysical level, this is also true. And that's a reflection of that. It's also true in all the other ways. When we don't have the right language to language our experiences, to say this is what is happening, or that is what is happening, to give a language, we feel threatened or humbled by the experience in a devastating way, because we don't have a way to contextualize it, to give it language. And the deepest level is because there's a shviras ois, a brokenness of sound. Now the brokenness eventually will return. There will be a healing of sound. And one of the processes of davening and learning is praying and learning Torah is to heal the sounds of the universe and to create a tikkun. But there will come a time, God willing, that we're already in this process, and God willing it will be revealed even quicker. There will come a time when all the sounds, all the broken sounds of the universe will return into its perfected state, will return into its correct state. So therefore, in the prophet, when the prophet Tzfania talks about the future, the world, the messianic world, the world of the redemptive world, the world of Achdus, the world of unity, he says, then there'll come a time that all will return to the Safa Brura, to the pure, refined language. What does that mean, return to the refined language? Which means that every language, on the deepest level, this means that every language would be included within the Lashon HaKodesh, within the Hebrew language, the Lashon HaKodesh, because every language would be expressing the Achdus Hashem, the oneness of Hashem. So let's think about this again that we said before. There is the klal, which is the principle, which is the root sound of the Chaf Beis Satar, which is Lashon HaKodesh, the 22 sacred sounds, which is the primary sounds, the primary grammar. Lashon HaKodesh is the Hebrew language. Then it multiplies into various different languages. It's because the shviras ois is the brokenness of the sounds, and the different types of shivim. The tzir for ois is the shivim lashonos. The tzir for the combinations of other sounds becomes the 70 languages, and it expresses multiplicity, and sometimes the opposites, or sometimes it's just the chitzoin, just the external, and sometimes it's even the opposite of the Achdas Hashem, the oneness of Hashem. And then, so we're living in the world of pratim, the world of the specifics, of the world of particularity, the world of separation and dissension and exile. And in us, in a future time, there'll be a safa brura, there'll be a return to the oneness of languages, which means that the higher, just like Yigar Sadusa, Asam Revius Kodesh, just like these words in the Torah are already language, are in the Torah itself, you have other languages, because the idea of the Torah is to include all the languages, to include all the sounds. There'll come a time when all the sounds of the universe will be expressing what? Hashem, the oneness of Hashem. When all the sounds of the universe, and every single sound, which means every single vibration, every single reality, because everything, the whole world is filled with sounds, which means everything is just another sound, another vibration. When all the vibrations of the universe is expressing the oneness of the Creator, the Achdas Hashem, the oneness of Hashem, that will be the highest level of Lashon HaKodesh, which is the inter-inclusion of all sounds. The root sound that's reflected into the various sounds, and now the various sounds return back into the root sound, so everything is sounding the oneness of Hashem. This is the higher vision of Safa Brura, which is the perfect language. The perfect language is the language when every single sound that you hear in the universe, all you're hearing is the oneness of Hashem. Where everything you encounter, everything you experience, every single reality that you're experiencing, you're seeing the oneness of Hashem, the unity of God. This is why the word uz is a very interesting word. Uz means then, simply means future tense. But the word uz also means past tense. For example, when the Torah says, Oz Yashem Moshe, then Moshe sang the song, which is after the story of the splitting of the sea. So Oz means then, means past tense, after the splitting of the sea. Then, in that story, Moshe sang the song. But Chazal are also Darish. Chazal tell us, the sages tell us, that the word Oz Yashem, that the shir Oz Yashem Moshe is Mekam Chis Meis Min HaTorah, that will come a time Oz in the future tense. Which means the word Oz, like the Maharal explains, the word Oz is the Aleph that is Reich Valazayin, is one that stands on the 7. 7 represents the fullness of creation. The one that stands above creation, which is number 8, is riding on the 7, which means that it can move backwards and forward. It means the past and the future, which means beyond time. So Oz is what the prophet is saying, Oz Yahachol Musafa Brura, then they'll return to the Safa Brura, saying is because L'Aslav, it will be revealed that in the beginning of the creation, in the story before the story of the Tower of Babel, the story with Mishami Parv, before the story when man dispersed throughout the entire earth and populated the earth and created different languages, there was originally, like Rashi writes, it was originally the people that lived in the Mesopotamian area and the cradle of civilization spoke Lashon HaKodesh. They spoke the sacred language. They all spoke that sacred language. That was the language that Adam, when the Torah describes that Adam called every single Ladas Shayikula, the Torah that Adam framed and languaged every single encounter, every single animal, and every single thing in this world, which means that he was expressing the Lashon HaKodesh, what that thing actually is. The reason why Adam was able to call a lion an Ari, which in Hebrew is the Lashon HaKodesh, is called Ari, is because he understood that Aleph Resh Yud Hey is the formation that allows for the lion to be a lion. That's the spiritual vibration that gives rise to the idea of lion. So Uz means both that it was in the past. There was a world which like the Rama writes in the there was a world in the beginning of time where everyone believed in absolute monotheism, where the Achdas Hashem was revealed, that the oneness of Hashem was revealed, and then it diminished. And the process of diminishing is because first they started worshiping the stars, and first they started giving honor to the stars, and they're worshiping the stars, and then everything went into a much more multiplicity and much more a place of idol worship. And the world became steeped in idol worship and all types of idol worship. And even today, we're in a world that people are idolizing and worshiping other things, whether it's money or power or fame, whatever that is that people are worshiping, which is also a form of idol worship. He's saying that in the beginning of time, where there was Achdas Hashem, the world was expressing the oneness of Hashem. Beginning of human civilization, we're expressing the oneness of Hashem. And there will come a time, us, which is because the past will be also the future, but this type of language will lead all the sounds of the universe, every single sound that ever was created, and every single language that ever was and is, will be all expressing the oneness of Hashem, the Achdas Hashem, when we speedily see this in our days and open our eyes to see the revealing of the coming of Mashiach, speedily. Amen.